The human cost, civilian lives and refugee crisis in Gaza and the West Bank. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has left a trail of devastation that is felt most acutely by the civilians caught in the middle. The human cost of this protracted conflict is staggering, with countless lives lost, families displaced, and entire communities suffering the consequences of violence, oppression, and instability. In Gaza and the West Bank, two of the most contested and volatile regions in the world, the daily reality for civilians is one of uncertainty, fear, and hardship. The refugee crisis, which began in the mid-20th century, remains a defining feature of Palestinian life and continues to shape the future of the region. In this exploration, we will delve into the human toll of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, focusing on the civilian suffering in Gaza and the West Bank, and the refugee crisis that has persisted for decades. From the loss of life and infrastructure to the displacement of millions, we will examine the immense challenges faced by ordinary people living in these territories. If you find this content thought-provoking and informative, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on future videos that delve deeper into the ongoing struggles of those living through one of the most enduring conflicts in modern history. The impact of military conflicts on civilian lives. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been marked by periods of intense military violence, particularly in Gaza, where Israeli military operations and Palestinian rocket attacks have caused significant harm to civilians. In both Gaza and the West Bank, civilians have borne the brunt of the violence, whether through direct attacks, collateral damage, or restrictions on basic necessities. Gaza, a war zone in perpetual conflict. Gaza, a densely populated coastal strip of land, has been the epicenter of much of the violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. With a population of nearly 2 million people living in an area of just 141 square miles, Gaza is one of the most overcrowded places on Earth. The region has experienced multiple rounds of warfare since Israel's withdrawal in 2005, including major conflicts in 2008-09, 2012, 2014, and more recent escalations in 2021. Each of these military operations has resulted in tens of thousands of civilian casualties, many of whom were women, children, and the elderly. Bombardments, airstrikes, and artillery shelling have devastated neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, leaving Gaza in a state of near-permanent destruction. The situation has been compounded by Israel's blockade of the region, which has restricted the flow of goods, medical supplies, and humanitarian aid. In addition to the immediate loss of life, the psychological toll on Gaza's population is profound. Years of conflict, the constant threat of violence, and the lack of access to essential services have created a mental health crisis in Gaza, with high levels of trauma, anxiety, and depression among children and adults alike. The West Bank, occupation and the struggle for basic rights. The West Bank, home to over 27 million Palestinians, is under Israeli military occupation. While the violence in the West Bank is less frequent than in Gaza, it is no less devastating for civilians. The occupation has led to widespread human rights abuses, including settlement expansion, arbitrary detentions, demolitions of homes, and restrictions on movement. Palestinian civilians in the West Bank live under constant surveillance, with military checkpoints and barriers that separate families and limit access to healthcare, education, and employment. Israeli military raids, often in response to Palestinian protests or acts of violence, have also resulted in significant civilian casualties. Over the years, thousands of Palestinians have been injured or killed during clashes with Israeli soldiers. The repression of protests, the destruction of crops, and the confiscation of land have made daily life increasingly difficult for Palestinians in the West Bank, deepening their sense of injustice and desperation. The refugee crisis, displacement, and its long-term consequences. One of the most enduring consequences of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the refugee crisis, which began in 1948 when approximately 750,000 Palestinians were forced to flee their homes during the Arab-Israeli War. This mass displacement created one of the largest refugee populations in the world, many of whom remain in refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Generations of displacement. The majority of Palestinians who were displaced during the 1948 Nakba catastrophe fled to neighboring Arab countries or were forced into refugee camps. These camps were intended to be temporary, but many have existed for over 7 decades. The descendants of those original refugees who were born and raised in these camps have known nothing but displacement, poverty, and uncertainty. Today, there are an estimated 7 million Palestinian refugees registered with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which provides services such as education, healthcare, and food aid to Palestinian refugees. However, the conditions in many of these camps remain dire, with overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, lack of employment opportunities, and limited access to basic services. The refugee crisis is a persistent reminder of the unresolved status of Palestinian refugees and their right to return to their homes, a central issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The psychological toll of displacement. For Palestinian refugees, the loss of their homes and the inability to return has had a profound psychological impact. Identity and nostalgia for their ancestral villages play a central role in Palestinian culture, and the inability to return to these places has created a sense of collective trauma. Generations of Palestinians have grown up in refugee camps, experiencing poverty, discrimination, and political instability. Many refugees see the return to their ancestral homes as a fundamental right and a symbol of resistance against occupation and dispossession. The mental health effects of living in refugee camps, especially for young people, are severe. Unemployment, lack of opportunities, and the frustration of living in limbo can lead to feelings of hopelessness, anger, and despair, fueling cycles of violence and unrest. The refugee crisis has also contributed to the fragmentation of Palestinian society, as different groups within the refugee population hold divergent views on how to resolve the conflict and their place in any future settlement. 3. The role of international aid and humanitarian organizations. In response to the immense suffering in Gaza, the West Bank, and the refugee camps, numerous international organizations and NGOs have provided vital humanitarian aid to Palestinians. The United Nations, through UNRWA, plays a central role in providing food, education, and healthcare to Palestinian refugees. However, the situation on the ground has been complicated by political realities, with aid often being restricted or politicized by both Israeli authorities and Palestinian factions. Despite the efforts of humanitarian organizations, aid is often insufficient to meet the growing needs of the civilian population. The blockade on Gaza, for example, has severely limited the importation of materials needed for rebuilding infrastructure and providing basic services. In addition, the lack of access to clean water, electricity, and medical care in both Gaza and the West Bank has made the humanitarian crisis even more dire. International efforts to mediate peace between Israel and Palestine have also failed to bring about a lasting resolution to the conflict. While various peace initiatives, including the Oslo Accords and the Arab Peace Initiative, have been attempted, a final settlement has remained elusive. As a result, the human cost of the conflict continues to mount, with Palestinians suffering the consequences of a seemingly intractable situation. The children of Gaza and the West Bank. The silent victims. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the suffering of its children. Thousands of Palestinian children have been killed or injured in the violence, many of them in Israeli airstrikes or military operations. The toll on Palestinian children extends far beyond physical injuries. The ongoing violence, the fear of bombings, and the lack of access to proper education and healthcare have left many children traumatized and without hope for the future. In Gaza, children are particularly vulnerable to the harsh realities of conflict. With schools often damaged or destroyed, many children are deprived of an education. The lack of psychological support, coupled with the trauma of growing up in a war zone, has created a generation of young people who have known little but fear, loss, and despair in the West Bank. The situation is similarly grim. Children grow up under military occupation, often subjected to violence, arbitrary arrests, and displacement. The constant presence of military checkpoints and the restrictions on movement add to the daily stress and hardship that children experience. Conclusion: a future of hope or despair. The human cost of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is incalculable. From the loss of life and the destruction of infrastructure to the ongoing displacement of millions of refugees, the suffering of civilians in Gaza and the West Bank is profound and enduring. The refugee crisis, which began in 1948, continues to be a source of great hardship and frustration for Palestinians, while the ongoing violence and repression in Gaza and the West Bank contribute to the cycle of suffering. As the conflict drags on, it is vital that the international community work toward finding a lasting solution that addresses the needs and rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. The human cost of this conflict is too great to ignore, and a just and peaceful resolution is the only way to ensure a future of hope and dignity for the people of the region. If you found this content impactful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the human stories behind global conflicts.